This video will take us into the forebrain. By the end of this video, you should be able to identify the major subcortical structures of the forebrain. So the forebrain is the most anterior and prominent part of the mammalian brain. It consists of the cerebral cortex and subcortical regions. And it's these subcortical regions that we're going to discuss in this video. So the subcortical areas that we're going to discuss in this video are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the basal ganglia, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So hopefully you've downloaded and printed up the anatomy handout, and as we go through these different areas, you can complete that handout, labeling the appropriate areas and matching it with the function. So the first area that we're going to discuss is the thalamus. And you see here the thalamus sits here nicely in the center of the brain. Now, the lines that you're going to label on the different aspects for your assignment may not be the same as the lines you see here, might not be in the same location, but the diagram should look fairly similar, so you should be able to identify them fairly quickly. Now, the thalamus sits here nicely in the center of the brain to do its job as a relay station. And so basically, incoming sensory information comes up and it has to relay here in the thalamus before going off to its appropriate cortical region. And also just to point out here, that's what we mean by subcortical. So this area up here is the cortex, and we'll talk about the lobes of the cortex in another video. But so this is all cortical brain regions, and so subcortical means that it's below that cortex. It's still part of the forebrain, but it's below the cortex. So again, all incoming information from our eyes, our ears, our mouth, and our skin all have to, as it's coming in along those nerves, it has to relay in the thalamus before it goes to the appropriate cortical regions. And then remember, we also have the reticular formation and the raphe formation that are arousing the cortex, getting it ready to sense that incoming sensory information. So I've heard a few analogies maybe that will help you understand the role of the thalamus. One is that it's the gatekeeper, the gatekeeper for all things sensory information, that information has to come here, the gatekeeper has to approve before it sends it to its appropriate cortical region. Another theory I've heard is like a police officer sitting in the middle of an intersection directing traffic, and so that incoming sensory information comes here, it relays in the thalamus, and then that traffic police officer, that traffic director, directs it to the appropriate cortical region. When I was taking neuroanatomy in my master's degree, we were going through, and this guy was going through and doing an anatomy session for us and slicing the brain. He called it the Jesus of the brain, and he said it sits here in the center of the brain. It knows all about what's going on in the brain, especially that sensory information, and so that's kind of what. So think of it as a police officer directing traffic, gatekeeper, the Jesus of the brain, whatever helps you to remember its role. Now, besides processing and sending that sensory information to the appropriate cortical region, we know that a lot of the connections in the thalamus come from the cortex. So it's kind of a bi-directional talk between the cortex and the thalamus. When I was studying Wernicke's-Korsakoff's in my master's degree, we were actually studying the thalamus. Here's just another diagram showing you the thalamic nuclei here. And that was one of the areas that was highly damaged in Wernicke's-Korsakoff's, both in human patients and in our animal model that we were studying. And remember that Wernicke's-Korsakoff's involves amnesia or severe memory impairments, a very unique memory impairments. So the thalamus appears not only important for the retrieval of memory, kind of like a librarian of the brain, and not only does it send signals to the right areas of the brain, but it acts as a relay station to retrieve that information. It appears to be important in motor control, states of consciousness. I know one of the people in our lab also studied it in terms of temperature regulation. So the thalamus sits here in the middle of the brain and has a lot of very important roles. The one that I want you to understand and remember the most is that relaying of sensory information. Here again, just showing you its location in the center of the brain, sending all of this information to the cortex and receiving information. Also important to note that the thalamus has various sets of nuclei. And so when we're in the periphery, and we talked about the dorsal root ganglion, that was a group of cells in the periphery working together for a common function. In the brain, we call them a nucleus or nuclei. And so the dorsal medial nucleus contains a group of neurons that work together for a common function. The lateral geniculate body contains a group of neurons working together for a common function, and so on and so forth. So just to know that there are different areas in the thalamus that work together for these common functions. The next area we're going to talk about is the hypothalamus. So the thalamus is here, and the hypothalamus sits right below it. Now we'll talk about the hypothalamus in several of the different behaviors that we talk about this semester. So the hypothalamus conveys messages to the pituitary gland to alter the release of hormones. So the pituitary gland is here, and we've already talked about that in terms of one of the major endocrine glands. See the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland kind of dangles off below the hypothalamus. And there's a lot of crosstalk between these two areas, but one of the main jobs of the hypothalamus is to send signals to that pituitary gland to release the hormones. The hypothalamus is also associated with emotions and drives that are vital to survival, and we'll talk about a few of these drives that are vital to survival. So think about it. What kind of things, and remember we talked about vital reflexes with the medulla. Now we're talking about drives that are vital to survival, things that without them we wouldn't survive, but they're not reflexes. They're not something that occurs on its own. So what do we need to survive? We need to eat. We need to drink. So hunger and thirst. What's one of the most important things for our species to survive? We need to reproduce. So reproduction, fear, knowing when to be afraid of something. So all of these, hunger, thirst, fear, temperature regulation, reproduction, other motivated behaviors, the area that controls our circadian rhythm for sleep is contained within the hypothalamus. So we'll talk about the hypothalamus in the first few behaviors we talk about: sleep, reproduction, and our stress response. All of those will involve hypothalamic responses. So next up is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, as we saw in the previous slide, is at the base of the hypothalamus, and it's a hormone-producing gland. So here you can see, just an enlargement to orientate ourselves. Here's the thalamus in the center of the brain. This is the front of the brain. This is, or the anterior portion of the brain. This is the posterior portion of the brain. And here in this little area here is enlarged. So this is the hypothalamus, and this is the pituitary gland. We have the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. And remember we said that anterior pituitary produces its own hormones, and the posterior pituitary does not produce its own hormones. The hypothalamus produces them, and when it's ready to release them, it sends them to the posterior pituitary. So again, the anterior pituitary produces 6 hormones. It produces ACTH, which controls secretions of the adrenal gland, TSH, prolactin, GH, which is growth hormone, and then LH and FSH. And a few of those we'll come back and talk about a little bit more. ACTH, LH, and FSH will be something that we'll talk about in different areas of the semester. But the release of these hormones is controlled by hormones from the hypothalamus. So that's important. Although the anterior pituitary produces its own hormones, the release of those hormones is controlled by the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary releases oxytocin and ADH. However, both of those are produced in the hypothalamus. So again, anterior produces its own hormones. The hypothalamus tells it when it can release them. The posterior pituitary does not produce its own hormones. The hypothalamus sends those hormones to the posterior pituitary when it deems necessary to release those hormones. But remember, there is a lot of crosstalk. So there's other things there's feedback loops that are going from the pituitary to the hypothalamus so that to kind of keep things in check. Next area of the brain we're going to discuss is the basal ganglia. And so that's what you see here, the different components of the basal ganglia being your globus pallidus, your caudate nucleus, and your putamen. The thalamus here isn't really part of the basal ganglia, but it does play an intricate role in communicating with the basal ganglia and allowing the initiation of movement. So the basal ganglia is associated with the planning of a movement, in particular, a procedural memory. Now we'll come back, if you don't remember the different types of long-term memory that you may have learned about in a Psych 100 class, we'll come back and talk about the different types of memory, and procedural memory is one of those for how to do something, some sort of action, something that becomes a habit over time. And so we'll come back and talk about those more. especially when we talk about movement. That's when we'll come back. We'll talk about it in terms of when we talk about memories, but then we'll also talk about movement, because if you think about it, knowing how to walk, knowing how to swing a golf club, all of those things, knowing how to ride a bike, all of those things involve movement, but they become habits. You don't think about them necessarily. And so the basal ganglia is very important in helping those movements be able to initiate. So the components of the basal ganglia are the caudate, putamen, and globus pallidus. And I always like to add the substantia nigra in because it projects to these regions, and it's important again in that initiation of movement. So here's the substantia nigra. Again, remember that stands for substance black. We saw that in the midbrain, right? So the substantia nigra contains dopamine-producing neurons that project to the basal ganglia. So here's the putamen, here's the caudate, here's the globus pallidus that has an internal and external component, and then here's the thalamus, just to orientate ourselves of where we are. So again, this would be down the center of the brain. We have a right hemisphere. Actually, this would be the right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. And again, just another diagram. This is showing you kind of from the sagittal view. Here would be your caudate. The thalamus is here in the pink. You have your globus pallidus, internal and external. Here they're calling it medial and lateral. Here's the substantia nigra. And so just understanding that that substantia nigra sends those dopamine projections to the basal ganglia, and that allows movement to initiate. And it's those procedural memories that it's allowing to initiate. And so when these projections die in Parkinson's disease, that's what causes those tremors and then ultimately the inability to initiate certain movements or difficulty in initiating movements. So the next area that we're going to discuss is the amygdala. And so you can see the amygdala here. And again, remember, all of these are on that little handout that you're going to be labeling and then matching the function with them. And so this diagram looks a little different than some of the others, but the amygdala and the hippocampus have also been added into that, and it looks pretty much like this, as best I could get it to. So you should be able to label those fine. Now, in terms of the amygdala, when I think of the amygdala, I think of emotion. And science is always changing and adding things on, and so we may learn different roles. We know now that emotion is not contained just in one area of the brain, but emotion and fear response, really the amygdala seems to play a big role in. So it has to do with arousal. It's important in the regulation of emotion. So it appears to play a role in anxiety and depression, perhaps because of this role in regulating emotion. And also this initial emotional response to sensory information. What I don't have listed here, things like emotional memory. I always have thought, when I learned about it back in school, I learned it as kind of like the fear response area, where you see it activated when animals especially have that fear response or fear reflex. So that's the amygdala. And if you see here, here's the amygdala, and then here's the next area we're going to talk about is the hippocampus. Here again, just orientate ourselves where here's the thalamus, this would be our pons, this is our medulla going down into the spinal cord and our cerebellum. And here's our cerebral cortex we'll talk about in another video. But the amygdala just kind of sits here at the very end of this hippocampal region. So the last area that we're going to talk about is the hippocampus. Now remember, this isn't an all-encompassing list. We haven't gone through all the different subcortical structures of the brain. We're just listing a few of the main ones that will become important as we go through the rest of the semester. So the hippocampus, think of it in terms of memory. So it's critical for storing certain types of memory. Now we'll learn in the memory chapter that not all memories are stored in the hippocampus, and not all memories, the hippocampus isn't responsible for all types of memory. In particular, it's important the storage of new information in memory. Particularly what we're going to learn is episodic memories. Now it may play a role in semantic memories, and if you don't remember the difference between those two, that's fine. We'll cover that in the memory chapter. Definitely new information. So as we're experiencing new things in the environment, all of that is potential new memories. And so the hippocampus processes that. We encode some of that and store that then in that hippocampal region. Because it's processing this new information, it's going to compare sensory information with the brain's expectations of the world. So if we have memories already stored, as this new incoming information is coming in, the hippocampus needs to decide, do we need to make a new memory? Is this something new that we need to process? It also allows us to form spatial memories for navigating the environment. And we'll go through the specifics really of the role of the hippocampus. We'll talk in a lot more detail about its job in memory, contextual aspects of it, the spatial aspects of it when we get to the memory chapter. So for now, just kind of remember that the hippocampus is important memory. People who have Alzheimer's disease, they lose cells in this area of the brain called the hippocampus early on, and those cells produce acetylcholine. So we'll come again and back and talk about that more when we get to that chapter. But hippocampus is important in memories, especially new memories and spatial memories.